In 1974, Johnny Carson did something that violated every rule of television. He stopped his show mid-broadcast to stop a tragedy. As security tried to drag a desperate young woman from the studio, Johnny uttered 3 words that would save her life and change his legacy forever. This is the unscripted miracle of Studio One. In the sea of faces under the bright lights of Studio One, a young woman was being forcibly stood up by 2 burly men in suits. She wasn't shouting or causing a scene in the way a heckler might. She was simply holding on. She was clutching a worn, overstuffed canvas bag to her chest, as if it contained her very soul, and her eyes were fixed on Johnny with a look of such profound, quiet desperation that it bypassed his comedy instincts and struck his heart. The audience began to murmur, their cheerful energy curdling into confusion as the security guards tried to hustle the girl toward the shadows of the exit. The orchestra, sensing a break in the rhythm, slowed their pace, and Ed McMahon tilted his head, his trademark smile faltering. To the millions watching at home, it was a glitch in the perfect machine of The Tonight Show. To Johnny, it was something else entirely. He saw the way her knuckles were white against the strap of her bag. He saw the way she looked at the stage, not with the hunger of a fame seeker, but with the hollow gaze of someone who had reached the absolute end of her rope. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life, a young woman who had perhaps walked across several states just to be in this room, only to be told she didn't belong. The lead security guard had his hand firmly on her arm, ready to hoist her toward the heavy, soundproof doors, but the girl's feet stayed planted for one more second. She wasn't fighting them with strength. She was fighting them with a silent, pleading prayer directed right at the man behind the desk. Johnny took a step toward the edge of the stage, the floorboards creaking under his polished shoes. He looked at Fred de Cordova in the wings, who was already making the cut sign with his hand, signaling for a commercial break to scrub this messy human moment from the airwaves. But Johnny didn't look away. He didn't make a joke to ease the tension. Instead, he raised a hand, silencing the band and the whispers of 500 people. The air in the studio became heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that only happens when a script is torn up in real time. Everyone expected the guards to finish their job, to remove the disturbance and let the comedy resume. They expected Johnny to pivot back to a joke about the weather or politics. But as he looked into the girl's tear-filled eyes, the silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable, until it became something sacred. Johnny's voice finally rang out, not with the playful lilt of a comedian, but with the quiet authority of a man who had decided that the rules of television no longer mattered. "Let her stay," he said, commanded, and the world seemed to stop spinning. The lead security guard's fingers twitched as they loosened their grip, his confusion mirroring the shock of the 500 people now sitting in a vacuum of silence. The command echoed through the rafters of Studio One, cutting through the mechanical hum of the air conditioning. The guard looked toward the wings, searching for any signal from the producers that this was a scripted moment of levity or a late-night prank. But there was no punchline coming. Johnny Carson stood at the edge of the stage, his silhouette sharp and imposing against the bright studio lights, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding seriousness. The young woman, whom we would later come to know as Sarah, seemed to collapse inward, her shoulders shaking as the physical pressure on her arm finally vanished. She didn't run, and she didn't cheer. She simply stood there in the third row, trembling like a leaf in an autumn gale. She was clutching that heavy canvas bag, the source of that mysterious silver flash, revealing it to be a tarnished silver buckle on the strap, the only valuable thing she seemed to own. Johnny didn't return to his mark behind the desk. He didn't look at the teleprompter. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stepping down from the stage, a move so rare it was whispered about in the hallways of National Broadcasting Company for years afterward. He was breaking the fourth wall, crossing the invisible line between the untouchable star and the people who loved him. The audience was breathless. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick blue carpeting. As Johnny approached the third row, the camera operators scrambled to pivot their heavy equipment, their cables hissing across the floor, as they tried to capture a moment they were never trained to film. Ed McMahon sat frozen at his desk, his glass of water forgotten, his eyes wide as he watched his friend do something completely unpredictable. Johnny reached the row where Sarah stood and gestured for the people beside her to make room. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking only at her, seeing the tear-stained cheeks and the sharp, metallic scent of pencil lead and charcoal that seemed to cling to her coat like a second skin. "I think you've been trying to tell me something all week, haven't you?" Johnny asked, his voice soft, carried only by the lapel microphone that picked up the catch in his throat. Sarah nodded slowly, unable to find her words, her breath coming in ragged hitches. She looked so small standing there, a girl in her early 20s who looked as though she carried the weight of a century on her back. The security guards retreated into the shadows, realizing that the rules of the building had been superseded by the compassion of the man who ran it. Johnny reached out a hand, not to take her bag, but to steady her. He didn't care about the timing of the show or the millions of dollars in advertising that ticked away with every second of silence. In that moment, the king of late night was just a man who recognized a soul in crisis. He leaned in closer, his eyes searching hers with a kindness that felt like a warm blanket on a freezing night. He whispered something to her that the microphones didn't catch, a private assurance that she was safe, that she was seen, and that for once in her life, she wasn't going to be pushed aside. With a shaking hand, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a battered, leather-bound sketchbook, its cover scarred and its spine held together by nothing but grit and tape. She held it out to him like a sacred offering, her eyes pleading for him to understand the weight of what she was handing over. Sarah did not look like the typical Burbank starlet. She looked like someone who had walked halfway across the country with nothing but a dream and a very heavy sketchbook. As she stood there in the third row, the harsh studio lights caught the dust on her worn boots and the faint gray smudges of charcoal on her fingertips. She was a stark contrast to the glitz and glamour that usually occupied those seats, the polished pearls and the forced laughter of people who had never known a day of true want. In her hands, that battered book looked like a heavy anchor, something she had protected through bus stations, rainy street corners, and the cold indifference of the world outside these walls. Johnny took the book from her with a gentleness that suggested he was handling a piece of ancient scripture. He didn't just flip through it. He stepped back toward the stage, sitting on the edge with his legs dangling over the side, inviting Sarah to sit on the very first step of the stairs leading up to his world. The audience watched in a trance as the most powerful man in entertainment turned the first page. It wasn't a collection of doodles or amateur fan art. It was a gallery of the human condition. Sarah had spent her nights in the audience not just watching the show, but studying the faces that sat in the hot seats across from Johnny. She had captured the subtle flicker of fear in a young actress's eyes before she delivered a practiced line, using soft, smudged shadows to show the tension in her jaw. She had sketched the weary slump of an aging athlete's shoulders, the heavy charcoal lines making the weight of his regret feel almost tangible. On every page, there was a profound sense of what it meant to be alive and vulnerable in front of millions of people. Sarah whispered that she had been coming to the studio for 6 straight nights, using the last of her meager savings for tickets, just hoping for a chance to show him that someone was really looking. She told him that she saw the hidden parts of people, the sadness that lives behind a smile, and the loneliness that follows a burst of applause. As Johnny turned the pages, his expression shifted from curiosity to a deep, resonant awe. He saw sketches of the stagehands, the musicians in the band, and even a heartbreakingly detailed portrait of a janitor leaning against a mop in the hallway, looking out a window at a world he felt he couldn't join. Sarah's voice was barely a thread of sound as she explained that she had no home left to go back to, no family to catch her, and that this book was the only proof she had ever existed at all. She had poured every ounce of her remaining hope into these charcoal lines, believing that if she could just show them to the man who made the whole world feel like a friend, maybe she wouldn't feel so invisible anymore. The deeper Johnny got into the book, the more the silence in the room began to feel like a prayer. He realized that this young woman wasn't just a fan, she was a witness to the truth that fame often tries to hide. He reached the middle of the book and paused, his thumb tracing the edge of a page that felt thick with layered pencil work, a page that seemed to vibrate with a different kind of energy. He turned that page slowly, his rings glinting under the stage lamps, and when he saw what was drawn there, the breath left his body in a sharp, audible gasp. If you find yourself moved by the hidden stories behind the icons of the silver screen, please consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the moments of grace and humanity that time has forgotten, ensuring these powerful legacies live on for a new generation. Johnny reached down to take the book, his rings glinting under the studio lights. But when he turned to the final page, the air left his lungs. It was a portrait of him, but not the Johnny Carson that appeared on the covers of magazines, or the one who delivered sharp-witted jabs at politicians. This was a man stripped of his armor. Sarah had captured him in a moment of stillness, perhaps during a transition to a commercial, or while he was listening to a guest tell a story of their own childhood. The drawing showed Johnny sitting behind that famous desk, his chin resting in his hand, looking out past the cameras into the dark void of the studio. In the charcoal lines, his eyes weren't bright with the anticipation of a laugh. They were filled with a profound, quiet longing. She had drawn the fine lines around his eyes, not as signs of age, but as roadmaps of a long journey taken in the public eye. There was a haunting quality to the way the shadows fell across his face, suggesting a man who gave everything to his audience until there was very little left for himself when the lights went down. Johnny stared at the image, his hands trembling slightly as he held the heavy paper. It was as if he were looking into a mirror that didn't reflect his face, but his very spirit. He had spent his entire life being the master of ceremonies, the one who controlled the narrative. Yet this young woman who had nothing had managed to see the one thing he tried most to hide. He looked up at Sarah, and for the first time in his career, the legendary Carson Cool was nowhere to be found. He saw her standing there, her coat dusty and her heart exposed. And he realized that she hadn't come here to ask for an autograph or a moment of fame. She had come to tell him that she understood him. She had looked through the television screen every night from whatever lonely room she occupied and recognized a kindred soul. The audience remained in a state of stunned reverence, watching their hero be completely disarmed by a piece of paper and a bit of burnt wood. Johnny's thumb moved over the drawing, tracing the outline of his own silhouette, and he felt a lump form in his throat that no amount of professional poise could swallow. He leaned toward her, the distance between the stage and the seats vanishing in the wake of such raw honesty. He asked her, his voice barely more than a whisper, how she could have known. How could she have seen the quiet man who sat alone in the dressing room long after the applause had faded? Sarah simply looked at him, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She told him that when you have lost everything, you start to see the things that other people are too busy to notice. She told him she saw his kindness, yes, but she also saw the weight of being the person everyone looked to for a smile when the world felt like it was falling apart. Johnny closed the book, but he didn't hand it back. He held it against his chest, right over his heart, as if he were shielding a flickering flame from a sudden draft. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw the precarious edge she was standing on. The silence that followed was not the staged pause of a veteran comedian, but the heavy, airless quiet of a man realizing he was the only thing standing between a stranger and the darkness. In that vacuum of celebrity, a terrifying truth began to emerge. The laughter that usually echoed through the rafters of Studio One had evaporated, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on everyone's shoulders. Johnny was no longer looking at Sarah as a fan or a guest. He was looking at her as a human being who was teetering on the very edge of the world. He saw the way her hands shook when she wasn't holding the book, and he saw the hollow, haunted depth in her eyes that spoke of a finality no one so young should ever have to contemplate. Sarah leaned in, her voice trembling so violently that the microphone struggled to catch the sound, but Johnny heard her. She confessed that she had arrived in Burbank with nothing but her sketches and a heart that had been broken one too many times by a world that didn't have room for a dreamer. She had lost her job, her home, and finally, her hope. She admitted that this night, this very show, was meant to be the conclusion of her story. She had decided that if she could just hand over her work, if she could just leave some small piece of her soul with the man who had been her only friend during her darkest hours, she could finally let go and pass away from the pain of her existence. The sketchbook was not a portfolio for a career. It was a last testament. It was her way of saying she was here before she chose to end her own journey. Johnny felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the studio air conditioning. He looked at the drawing of himself again, realizing that she had seen his hidden sorrow because she was drowning in her own. The weight of her struggle hit the studio like a physical wave, and even Ed McMahon, usually so quick with a jovial remark, put his head in his hands. The audience, many of whom were parents and grandparents, felt a collective ache in their chests. This was no longer a variety show. It was a rescue mission happening in real time before 20 million witnesses. Johnny reached out and took Sarah's hands in his. They were ice cold. He told her, his voice thick with an emotion he usually kept under lock and key, that the world was a much darker place without people who could see the beauty in the shadows. He told her that her eyes were a gift, not a burden, and that he wasn't going to let her slip away into the night. He ignored the frantic waving of the floor manager and the red light of the cameras that demanded he move the segment along. He looked at this girl who had planned to cease living that very night, and he made a silent vow that he would be the bridge back to the light for her. He didn't care about the ratings or the sponsors or the rigid schedule of the National Broadcasting Company. He saw life flickering like a candle in a storm, and he moved to shield it with everything he had. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt as though the very air might shatter. NBC went to a commercial break, but for the people in Studio One, the show didn't stop. It became a miracle. While millions of Americans at home were watching colorful advertisements for laundry detergent and new cars, a profound transformation was occurring on that famous stage in Burbank. Johnny Carson did something that defied every rule of television production. He turned his back on the cameras, unclipped his microphone, and signaled for the house lights to stay up. Behind him, the producers were shouting in hushed, panicked tones about the tens of thousands of dollars in lost revenue per second, but Johnny stood his ground. He didn't retreat to his desk to check his notes or speak with his writers. Instead, he stayed right there on the edge of the carpeted stairs, sitting side by side with a girl who had nothing left to lose. For those 7 minutes, the king of late night was just a man named John, and he was talking to Sarah as if they were sitting on a porch in Nebraska rather than under the glare of $100 million worth of equipment. He didn't ask her for her name or her hometown first. He asked her why she thought her art wasn't enough to keep her here. He leaned in so close that their foreheads almost touched, creating a private sanctuary in the middle of a cavernous room, while executives in the wings watched the clock with sweat on their brows. Sarah's walls, built up over months of rejection and hunger, finally began to crumble under the weight of his genuine attention. She told him about the Greyhound bus ride that took 4 days, the nights spent sleeping in the terminal, and the way the world seemed to look right through her because she didn't have a fancy title or a sparkling smile. Johnny listened with a focused intensity that made the audience feel as though they were intruding on a confession. He told her about his own early days, about the terrors of failing and the moments when he felt like a fraud in a tuxedo. He looked her in the eye and told her that her ability to see the pain in others was not a weakness, but a superpower that the world desperately needed. He asked her one life-changing question that seemed to hang in the air like a glowing coal. If I told you that I needed you to see the world for me, would you stay? The sheer weight of that request, the idea that someone as monumental as Johnny Carson could actually need anything from a girl in a dusty coat, sent a shock through Sarah's entire being. She looked at him, her eyes searching for any sign of a joke or a performance, but she found only the raw, unvarnished truth. In that darkened studio, with the clock ticking toward the return of the broadcast, a silent pact was formed between a legend and a stranger. Johnny stood up first, but he didn't leave her behind. He reached down and gripped her hand, pulling her up to the level of the stage, a symbolic elevation that brought a sob from several people in the front row. He whispered one last thing in her ear, a secret promise that made her eyes go wide with a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like hope. When the red light finally blinked back on, Johnny was standing again, but his tuxedo jacket was gone. It was wrapped around Sarah's trembling shoulders. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger changed your life? Perhaps a kind word from a passerby, or an unexpected gesture from someone you barely knew, gave you the strength to keep going. We would love to hear your stories of human connection in the comments below. The millions of viewers at home returned to a sight they would never forget. The most famous man in television standing in his shirt sleeves, his tie loosened, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that made the lens feel like it was disappearing. Beside him, Sarah looked like a lost child who had finally been found, the expensive wool of the jacket swallowing her small frame. But her face was no longer cast in shadows. Johnny did not go back to his desk to introduce the next guest. He stayed at center stage, holding Sarah's sketchbook like a treasure he had spent a lifetime searching for. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny began, his voice ringing with a newfound resonance that filled every corner of the studio. "I want you to look at this young woman." He told the audience that Sarah was not just a fan who had wandered into the studio, but a master of the human spirit. He announced to the world that he was buying every single drawing in that book, and he named a price that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the room, an amount of money that would not just pay for a meal or a hotel room, but would provide a foundation for an entire life. He told her, and the millions watching, that she was never going to have to worry about where she would sleep or where her next meal would come from again. But it was what happened next that truly broke the hearts of everyone in attendance. Johnny reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a single Tonight Show cue card. He took a pen from the conductor's stand and wrote something on the back of it, his hand moving with a steady, purposeful grace. He handed the card to Sarah and told her that this was her ticket to a new beginning. He told the world that he had written exactly 12 words on that card, 12 words that would act as a heartbeat for her for the next 30 years. He explained that he wasn't just giving her money, he was giving her a job in the art department of the network, a place where her vision could be seen by the world. Sarah tried to speak, her lips moving but no sound coming out, as the sheer weight of this grace washed over her. She looked at the card, then up at Johnny, and finally, she did something that wasn't allowed in the rigid protocols of late-night television. She stepped forward and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his white dress shirt. Johnny held her, patting her back with a fatherly tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of the camera operators and the stagehands who had seen it all. He wasn't the king of comedy at that moment. He was a man who had reached into the dark and pulled someone back from the edge of the abyss. He leaned down and whispered to her that the note on the card was for her eyes only, a reminder for the days when the shadows tried to return. He then signaled to a production assistant to lead her to his private dressing room, the most exclusive sanctuary in Burbank, where she could rest and realize that her life had truly begun anew. People often wonder what happened to the girl from row 3 once the lights went down and the limousine Johnny ordered pulled away into the California night. For many in the audience, she was a fleeting moment of daytime drama captured in the glow of a cathode ray tube, a face that flickered for a few minutes before the local news took over. But for Sarah, that night in 1974 was not an ending. It was the first sunrise of a life she had previously believed was over. The journey from the brink of despair to the pinnacle of the art world did not happen overnight, but the momentum of Johnny's belief carried her through every storm that followed. With the resources Johnny provided and the position he secured for her, Sarah began to heal. She moved from a cramped motel room into a small studio filled with light, where the only thing that hit the floor was the charcoal dust of her creations, the fine gray powder that had once been the only thing she owned. She didn't just work in the background. She became a visionary whose sketches defined the look of some of the most beloved programs of the decade. But she never forgot the man who had seen her when she was invisible. For 20 years, she lived by the mantra written on that crumpled cue card, those 12 words that became her North Star whenever the world felt cold. She became a renowned artist, yet she always signed her most personal pieces with a tiny, stylized drawing of a Tonight Show microphone, a secret tribute to the man who saved her. Johnny followed her career with the quiet pride of a guardian. He never took credit for her success in the press, and he never invited her back on the show for a "Where are they now?" segment. To him, The act of kindness was only pure if it remained largely between the two of them. He would occasionally receive a card in the mail, always with a new sketch, perhaps a landscape or a portrait of a stranger on a park bench, and he would tuck them away in a private folder he kept in his home in Malibu. Those who visited him noticed that while his shelves were lined with Emmy Awards and honors from presidents, there was one drawing framed in his private study that he seemed to look at more than any other. That drawing was her mirror to his soul, and the card was her mirror to her own. Sarah once told a close friend that during the darkest hours of her recovery, when the memories of her time on the streets threatened to pull her back down, she would hold that card until her fingers went numb. It proved that a man who had everything had stopped the world for a girl who had nothing. She had transitioned from a ghost in the third row to a woman whose art made others feel less alone, completing the circle of compassion that Johnny had started. In 2004, just months before Johnny left us, a package arrived at his home in Malibu with no return address, only a single charcoal drawing. If this story reminded you that even the smallest gesture of kindness can ripple through decades, please share it with someone who might be feeling invisible today. You never know whose life you might change simply by letting them know they are seen. The man who had once commanded the attention of the entire world sat in his favorite chair, the Pacific Ocean crashing against the shore outside his window, and felt a familiar weight in his hands. It had been exactly 30 years since that Tuesday night in Burbank, 30 years since he had looked into the eyes of a desperate girl in the third row and decided to stop the clock. As he unwrapped the parcel, his fingers, now showing the gentle tremors of age, pulled back the tissue paper to reveal a masterpiece. It was a drawing of a hand, strong, seasoned, and reaching out from a sea of darkness to grasp the hand of another. The detail was so exquisite that Johnny could see the fine texture of the skin and the warmth radiating from the grip. There was no note included this time because none was needed. The artist's style was unmistakable. It was the same charcoal stroke that had once captured the hidden sadness in a young woman's heart. Sarah had sent him one final thank you, a visual testament to the moment she was pulled back from the edge of her existence. Johnny stared at the image for a long time, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across his study, and for a moment, the years seemed to melt away. He wasn't an 80-year-old man in retirement. He was back in that studio, smelling the floor wax and hearing the hum of the cameras. He remembered the coldness of Sarah's hands and the way her voice had broken when she admitted she was ready to cease her time on this earth. He realized then that while the world remembered him for the jokes and the legendary guests, his true legacy was sitting right there in his lap. It was the life that continued to breathe, to create, and to love because he had dared to be human for 7 minutes on national television. He placed the drawing on the small table beside him, right next to the worn cue card he had kept in his wallet for 3 decades. When Johnny finally passed from this world in early 2005, his family found that cue card tucked inside a small wooden box. On one side were the notes for a long-forgotten monologue about the rising price of gasoline. On the other side, in Johnny's hurried but elegant script, were the 12 words that had served as Sarah's anchor. They read, "The world needs your eyes to see the things the rest of us miss." It was a simple sentence, but it was the reason a talented woman was still walking the earth, painting the world in shades of hope rather than shadows of despair. While the world remembers Johnny Carson for his late-night comedy, his true legacy lies in the quiet kindness he showed people like Sarah. In 1974, he stepped out of the spotlight to see someone who felt invisible. By truly noticing Sarah, he gave her more than just help. He gave her the permission to matter. Because Johnny saw her as a masterpiece in progress, she was able to survive and become a beacon of hope for others. In a world of noise, Johnny Carson proved that the greatest success is simply making one person feel seen. He showed us that you don't need a spotlight to change a life, just the heart to listen. Johnny's gift to Sarah was the reminder that no one is truly alone. To her unspoken question, "Do I matter?" his actions gave the only answer: yes, more than you know. The most important people aren't always on stage. Sometimes they are just waiting for someone to notice them. Has someone ever made you feel seen? Tell us in the comments. Let's honor the power of noticing the invisible. If this story of Johnny Carson and Sarah touched your heart, please give this video a chance to help us share more moments of human grace with the world. To ensure you never miss these deep dives into the powerful, hidden legacies of our favorite icons, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. What's your favorite memory of a simple act of kindness? Let us know in the comments below.